Welcome, everybody. I'm Doris Epstein. Tonight's presentation, Cold War II, Israel, the US, the Middle East, and the world post-election, is brought to you by the Canadian Institute for Jewish Research, CIJR. CIJR began in Montreal well over 35 years ago, when a group of professors became alarmed at the soaring rate of anti-Semitism on Montreal campuses. Led by Professor Fred Krantz, they decided to fight back through speakers, conferences, publications, whatever it took to fight the misinformation and biases against Israel and the Jewish people. A goal that continues sadly to this very day and with even greater need. Through CIJR's publications, you can depend on in-depth, fact-based analyses of Israel, Jewish culture, and world politics. You'll find information and news here that you'll never find on mainstream media. We're living today in a world that is rapidly changing. This current state of global affairs is being called Cold War II by many. In today's special international webinar, we take a hard look at the new reality with Sir Andrew Roberts joining us from the United Kingdom and Professor Mordechai Kedar joining us from Israel. But to tell you more about them, here is founder and executive director of CIJR, Professor Fred Krantz.
Thank you, Doris. Welcome to the Canadian Institute for Jewish Research, everybody, and to our international seminar on Cold War II. We'll weigh the implications of two related developments. For the Middle East, Israel's remarkable victory after October 7th over Iran and its proxies, above all Hamas and Hezbollah. And for Europe, that means Russia, Ukraine, NATO region, and Asia Pacific, China, vis-a-vis Taiwan, for example. We'll weigh the impact of Donald J. Trump's massive recent electoral victory. We have two remarkable participants tonight, our primary speaker, Andrew Roberts, and his interlocutor, Mordechai Kedar. Both are members of CIJR's Academic Council. They'll address the issues. Dr. Roberts, an old colleague, not an old colleague, but a colleague and an old friend, is a fine, superb British historian, one of the outstanding historians working today, perhaps the best. And he has a remarkable oeuvre of over 20 works, 20 monographs spanning European history after the French Revolution. He's written studies of prime ministers, of Halifax, Chamberlain's foreign secretary, of Napoleon and Wellington, of Hitler, Churchill, FDR, and Stalin. In 2009, The Storm of War, the finest one-volume history of World War II yet written, a remarkable work, appeared, followed to international acclaim in 2018 by what I consider his masterwork, the remarkable and eloquent Churchill, Walking with Destiny, superb historical biography. That work was preceded already earlier on by his own, Andrew's own work, History of the English-Speaking Peoples since 1900, which was already following in Churchill's footsteps, as you know, because he had written a similar history. Wonderful book. As president of the Cambridge Association, Conservative Association, a fellow of Hoover Institution at Stanford, honored by myriad international associations, Andrew Roberts has been a major public voice and force in defense of Jewish Israel. He founded with former Spanish President Jose Maria Aznar the Friends of Israel movement, and his spirited advocacy of Israel now echoes as well from the benches of the House of Lords, where he sits as Baron Roberts of Belgravia. Andrew's interlocutor tonight, Dr. Mordechai Kedar, with a doctorate in Arabic culture and history from Bar-Ilan University, is a renowned student of Middle Eastern Arab language, literature, and culture. Born in Tel Aviv to Jewish Polish parents, whose native language was Yiddish, Mordechai acquired perfect Arabic in part through his career in Israeli military intelligence. His scholarly range is wide, for instance, his normative work on public political language of the Assad regime in Syria. And he is famous across the Middle East for appearing on hostile Arab TV to debate and defeat fervently anti-Israel speakers. He has a following among Arabs in the Arab world, which is quite remarkable. He works as well on the impact of European anti-Semitism, of the massive recent migrations of Arab and Islamist groups to Europe. And he has, since October 7th, been a tireless presence and truth teller in North American media and before embattled community groups. In closing, allow me a brief appeal. CIJR, now in its 38th year, is a unique institution, an independent academic, pro-Israel and proudly Zionist research think tank. We are internationally respected for our daily Israelnet briefing journal, for our proven work with students on and off campus, and our informative Zoom seminars, of which tonight's presence is an example. Please, therefore, we are funded by individual donations. So please, tonight, make as generous a donation as you can to enable us to continue our work. We are facing an immense problem in North America, but also across the world, Europe and so on, of a rising anti-Semitism based on outright support for terrorism. And our academic institutions, our media, our entertainment world is saturated with this vicious nonsense, with this aggressive, vicious stuff. So please, make as generous a donation as you can to enable our students, our pro bono academic faculty, to do its proven work over almost 40 years. But with that, I'll close and give the baton back to Mordechai Kedar. If we have time, as Doris noted, we'll have a few questions from the audience at the end of the seminar. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Professor Krantz. And, you know, sometimes when people talk about the Middle East, they ask themselves and the audience, where should I begin? In the days of Muhammad, in the days of the Ottomans, in the days of the Arab Spring, where is the starting point, especially when our time is limited? I would like to start with today and to go a little bit backwards, and that's it, which maybe methodically it's not the best way, but I think that we have to tackle things which happen actually today and yesterday. And this is what happens in Syria. Syria now, well, the Syria as we knew for many years, is today in a very big danger. Very big danger. Because a whole army of rebels, of who knows how many groups and militias, who waited in the Idlib northern district of Syria for like 13 years. They are preparing to what is happening almost a week, especially today. They were arming themselves, training themselves, getting equipment, cars, armored cars, building armored cars in order to get rid of the Assad regime and all those militias, especially Iranian led militias who are in Syria. They took advantage of two major things. First of all, the situation with Hezbollah of Lebanon, which Israel succeeded during the last couple of months to weaken significantly. This is one thing. And second thing is the fact that Russia is deep in the Ukrainian mud. And now we are actually already in the winter. These two powers, Hezbollah and Russia, which are two of the three main supporters of the Assad regime. The third is Iran. When two of them, Hezbollah in Iran and Russia, are either destroyed, as the Hezbollah is, or preoccupied with other fronts like Russia, now is the time and now is the day which they decided, and very brightly they did it. In the first day, they occupied the city of Aleppo, the second city in Syria, or even the economic capital of Syria. They got rid of the Russians who were in their place, got rid of the Syrian army in the area of Aleppo, and ran down south to Hamat, in another city of Hamat, and very well remembered from 1982, the big massacre, which on February 1982, the Syrian army killed something between 20 and 30,000 of Muslims in Hamat. Today, Hamat was liberated from the rule of Assad and the Iranian militias, Shi'i militias. And now this army of rebels is running down to Homs, and beyond Homs there is Damascus, the capital. If they succeed to take Homs over and Damascus as well, Syria as a state has left the Iranian pact, has become a siege on Hezbollah, and Hezbollah people will run away from Lebanon like cockroaches, because they know exactly what those people will do to them. They will slaughter them after what Hezbollah did to the Syrians in 2017 and 18, when they were fighting ISIS, and they were every place which they did not succeed to occupy, they just put a siege on it, and people died out of hunger and thirst. And this is how Hezbollah killed thousands of Syrians. Now came the time of revenge. And here in the Middle East, people would take revenge after 40 years and will say that we were hasty. This is the culture of this region. Ladies and gentlemen, this is what happens today, these days, in Syria. All the wounds of the past are being opened and bleeding. The memories of the massacres of the regime, not only from the Arab Spring since 2011, already the massacres between 1976 and 1982, which also cost the lives of some 50,000 Muslims in Syria. Everybody now talks about the Alawis, who are infidels, idol worshippers, and there is no way to accept such a regime when the citizens are Muslims. There is no way for a Muslim to live under the yoke of infidels. This is against the rules of physics in the Islamic thinking. And this is what we see today. The Sunnah now are coming back in order to kick out Iran, the Shi'i state, with all its proxies. And the next state is Iraq, when the Sunni minority, but significant minority, will try to get rid of the Shi'i militias. And the next one is in Iran, because when people in Iran see how the Iranian octopus, all his tentacles are being cut one after the other. Israel cut the one in Lebanon. Now the rebels are cutting the one on Syria. Others will do it in Iraq. It encourages them to run to the streets and to get rid of the head of the octopus, which is the Ayatollah regime in Iran. Ladies and gentlemen, what we see today is actually the most important result of the war which Hamas started on October 7. It took time, it took effort, it took, unfortunately, many casualties, but the fact that Israel turned the table over the heads of Hezbollah actually turns now to work against Iran. This in addition to what will happen in 20th of January, means like in 40 days from today, maybe a bit more, 50 days, when Trump will step into the White House. This is a big encouragement for everyone who is against Iran and the Iranian expansionism. And you know what, between you and me, if I was an Ayatollah in Iran, I would start to look for a better place to live in, because everybody will be against them, the Iranians and the others. And the whole thing now, in my humble view, is going to change. The Middle East is going to change dramatically as a result of this war. And what happens today in Syria is a very important development in this change. No, there is no Cold War. This is a real war, because the real war now is in the Middle East and the Ukraine in parallel lines, which are interconnected. Don't forget that Iran supports Russia against Ukraine. Iran now struggles in order to keep its stronghold in Syria. Now they need the weapons in Syria. Will they give them to the Russians? I'm not sure. Means the drones and the missiles which they produce. I'm not sure. Will the Russians accept it? I'm not sure. Means this war in Syria, which the Iranians did not expect, now they are a potential question of big fight between the Iranians and the Russians. Where will the Iranian weapons go? To Syria or to Russia against the Ukrainians?
Thank you very much indeed. I'd just like to preface my remarks by saying that I'm a huge admirer of CIJR. I think that the way in which that Fred, over so many years, and I've known him for well over 20 years, has turned CIJR into a foremost struggler against anti-Semitism is something that's incredibly admirable, and I really do encourage everybody watching today to dig deep and help the work that he's doing. With regard to what Mordechai was saying, I couldn't agree more. You're quite right to throw historical chronology away. That's not something a historian says very often, but you're absolutely right to start this discussion with what's happening today in Syria, rather than going back to the original caliphate and so on. It is obviously going to be game-changing if it turns out that Russian and Iranian air superiority, indeed in many areas air dominance, does not translate to anything that's actually happening on the battlefield. It seems extraordinary that this is unusual, speaking as a military historian, very unusual, that the side that has air superiority does not actually prevail on the ground. But that seems to be what is happening in what has already happened in northwest Syria, and seems to be happening on the road to Homs and maybe also ultimately Damascus. So we've got to look now, I think, into a post-Assad world, which, as Mordechai points out, could be extremely unpleasant for Iran, but also as the regional power, which is already reeling, as he says, from Israel's victories in the north and the south. But also, we've got to remember that the coalition of forces that is moving in on Damascus and will not be happy until they see Assad dead or in exile, are a real ragbag of organizations. You've got strong jihadists who, of course, hate Israel just as much as anybody else in that region. You've got Kurdish, you've got Turkish-backed and indeed Western-backed organizations as well. When I say organizations, I mean armies, essentially, fighting there. And so who finally wins out is going to be something that is going to, as Mordechai says, absolutely be a game changer. So so I'm very much in agreement on this. I think it's a time actually when Western intervention would be helpful. Of course, back in 2013, President Obama set out his red lines and then ignored his own red lines when Assad used chemical weapons on his own people. So it isn't there isn't any real prospect, it seems to me, of significant Western intervention here, not least because, of course, Donald Trump has come to power preaching against the concept of forever wars. So yes, I think this is a really important aspect of what's going on, not just in the Middle East, but also, of course, it'll have wider ramifications.
I have a question, Andrew. Where do you see the Russian-Ukrainian war direction? Where does it go?
Well, again, the election of Donald Trump implies that if he does carry out his promise to end the war on day one, the Ukrainians are going to have to try to continue fighting with only the rest of NATO's help. And that will be catastrophic for Zelensky. It seems like he recognizes that already. He made a speech last week in which he started to put out feelers about a possible peace negotiation. I think what we might well wind up with is if NATO and the West minus America doesn't stump up the necessary support, and by the way, it doesn't even have anything like the really advanced weaponry that the United States has got, and I suspect will not be giving to Ukraine after the 20th of January. And so instead, you're going to wind up with a horrific 800+ mile long scar across that part of Europe. And if Ukraine is not taken into NATO, then you'll have, it's not just going to be a scar like the demilitarized zone in Korea, for example. It's actually going to be an active low-level conflict zone. So it's neither Zelensky nor Putin can really do a deal in the situation that we've got at the moment, although, as I say, Zelensky recognizes that one day he might have to. I'm afraid the Europeans, including the British, did not go anything like far enough when it came to sequestrating the frozen assets of the Russians in Europe. We've got $300 billion that's held in Euroclear that we could have taken and given to the Ukrainians to reconstruct their nation and obviously also fight this war, but we didn't do that. And so all in all, I don't see any good outcome at the moment for the Ukrainians. Not least, of course, because we're talking, as Mordechai was talking earlier, about the interaction between this axis between the Russians and the Iranians, and the Iranians are sending huge amounts of drones. In fact, they've got a drone factory inside Russia as we speak. But also the North Koreans, of course, are they've sent 10,000 troops to the Kursk Oblast. They're fighting there. Not so well. Everything I've heard is that actually North Koreans haven't turned out so far, at least, to be very good soldiers, which is hardly surprising considering that their army hasn't fought since 1953. But nonetheless, they are cannon fodder, and Russia needs cannon fodder. And so you have this way in which, yes, Iran is an octopus, but for me, China also is the much larger octopus, because Iran is one of the tentacles of the Chinese octopus, as is Russia, as is North Korea, and other countries that are hoping to join too. So this is an extremely wide global I call it Cold War II, or actual, as Mordechai was implying, the beginnings of the foothills of World War III. Whatever it is, whatever you want to call it, it is posing an extremely unpleasant threat to the West and to our values and to our civilization.
My question is, where is the Canadian government vis-a-vis these global tensions which Andrew mentioned?
Well, I think the record of the Trudeau government has been dreadful. It's a government which has betrayed a very noble Canadian tradition established during World War I and II of fighting far beyond its capacities, right? Donating tremendous force and resources. It's woke under Trudeau. He's supported by the NDP, which is a socialist party, which has kept him in power because his is a minority government. Without the socialists, he wouldn't have a majority and his government would fall. He has given no support to Israel, really, quite the reverse. And he's even supported the recent atrocious judgment of the International Criminal Court. Trudeau has said that if Bibi Netanyahu were to set foot in Canada, he would have him arrested because he wants to comply with the ruling of the International Criminal Court. So it just goes from bad to worse. Canada now is the scene of violent anti-Israel, anti-Zionist demonstrations led by Islamist groups, but also by thuggish students. And recently in Montreal and Toronto, within the last 2 weeks, there have been a series of outbreaks and violent demonstrations, which are called pogroms. We've seen something recently in Amsterdam and partially in France, of course, but also in England. But now in Canada, a revival of the 19th century pogrom, with a new kind of peculiar amalgam of traditional anti-Semitism with a strange, surreal idealization of terror, viciousness, and murder. To watch these students on campuses like Harvard or Toronto or McGill parading with Hamas flags, the flags of the murderers of October 7th, it's not only depressing, it's nauseating. And the Canadian government, unfortunately, like the American government under the Biden administration, has done little or nothing to prevent this. Okay, this outbreak of anti-Semitism across the board, and it's not only on campus, it's in the streets. So we're looking at a very difficult situation. To some extent, I think in the States, there's been a remarkable development insofar as the recent election is concerned, in which the people have in fact overthrown the hoped for hegemony of the Democratic radicals. Their sort of de facto takeover of government, the drive to create a one-party state. But that has been shattered by the victory of Trump, which is a remarkable victory because he actually won the electoral vote, not just in the college of electors, but in the general public, the general vote. And there is a mass movement now in the States to restructure the society, to go back to constitutional norms, to do away with all of the shenanigans of the Democrats as they dominated the institutions. And something like that is coming in Canada, because all polls indicate that were there to be an election today, the conservative leader, Poilievre, would win a massive victory to the order of 75 to 80% of the vote. So something is coming. The socialist leader may withdraw, thinking that he can perhaps become the dominant force, which I think is wrong. But I don't think that Trudeau has much more political life left. And we're going to see in Canada something like the wave that we've experienced in the United States. And for our seminar today, I think the revolution in leadership in the United States, the emergence of the Republican Party as a broad-based popular party involving Black people, white people, working people, young people, women, something like that is coming in Canada. When that happens, we'll see a transformation. So I would say in the medium run, and immediately at the moment, Biden still has 40, 50 days left. Evidently, he'll do what he can to muck things up for Trump, but not too badly, one hopes. Similarly, in Canada, until the election comes, we'll see Trudeau continuing this passive policy of wokeism and leftism, but something is coming in Canada too. So in the medium run, looking at a year, I think Israel is in very good shape. As Mordechai has said, as Andrew has said, it's remarkable that Israel, largely alone and facing American opposition, has defeated Hamas, has defeated Hezbollah, has put Iran back on its back foot. In fact, we had the recent attack, which included a nuclear facility. The Iranians are, I think, more or less impotent when it comes to the current situation. And now the Syrian thing exploding on top of everything else. So, I mean, if you take a long-term view, the book of the future is, of course, the hardest book to read. But it would seem to me that the terrible sacrifices of Israel across this period will bear fruit finally in a restructured Middle East. But more importantly, the issue is what will happen vis-a-vis America and Russia in Ukraine and China, and what's going to happen on the Korean Peninsula with this North Korean nuclear power under the hands of what may or may not be a madman, or certainly an unbalanced character.
Especially as President Putin seems to be giving delivery systems to, or at least allowing the North Koreans to work out how delivery systems can be built in North Korea. Because as soon as that happens, I think that President Trump is going to have to act, because he cannot be the president who allows North Korea to build a deliverable nuclear bomb that could hit LA or San Francisco. So that's another potential spark. So also obviously is President Xi, the importance of that President Xi of China wakes up every morning and decides that's not the day to attack Taiwan. I think that's more likely that he's not going to, as a result of having a highly unpredictable president like Trump in the White House, rather than a sort of left-leaning appeaser, essentially, like Biden or as Harris would have been. You also are quite right. I mean, we should be congratulating Bibi Netanyahu on these victories. He's done a most extraordinary job, it strikes me. Now, again, these jobs are not over by any means. There are still dozens of hostages. Only day before yesterday, I met Mandy Damari, the mother of the only British hostage, Emily Damari, who is 28 years old, and she's down there in one of those tunnels, and it's utterly heart-wrenching. But overall, of course, the struggle against Hamas has been fantastically successful, down to the immense courage of the IDF, and it seems today also the projected realliance between Fatah and Hamas seems to have hit a rock and isn't about to happen. So there are, and then up with them in the north with Hezbollah, what a victory! It's been fantastic, but also, of course, the ceasefire didn't last terribly long, and you still having some Hezbollah rockets being fired. So it's by no means even the end of the beginning, frankly, let alone the beginning of the end. But nonetheless, it's looking an awful lot better than it was this time last year for Israel on every front. And I think, ultimately the Prime Minister must be congratulated for that.
Yes. Mordechai, what do you think about that?
Well, definitely, we see the West in general, and some countries like in Europe and maybe Canada as well today, how they try to appease the jihadists. And this is actually what happens. This is something so wrong, you have no idea. how much the jihadists are encouraged by the reluctance of Western Europe, I believe Canada as well, and some other countries, of course the United States, and now under the current administration, the jihadists all over the world, in Iran, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria, and others, are definitely encouraged by the weakness which the West projects vis-a-vis the global issues. When they see Western countries betray each other, how Europe treats Israel. You know, France announced, it means the Macron, he announced that if Netanyahu comes to France, he will indict him. He will catch him and give him to the International Court of Crime, Criminal Court. What I mean, this is how you treat somebody who defends France from the jihad which comes from the Middle East. The problem is the jihad is already has occupied France because the migration jihad turned France into something like northern Algeria. Once Algeria was southern France. Today, France is northern Algeria. And this actually dictates decisions and attitudes of France. France is not French anymore, at least not potentially. Britain, with a slow occupation of Islam, which migrates to Britain in big numbers. Britain is not British anymore in large parts. If you walk in East London, forget it. You came to some Middle Eastern town, and not the best ones. If you go to Brussels, if you go to Amsterdam, all these totally Western countries which were until 10 years ago, today they are not Western anymore. And the pace of change is dramatic. And this is why decisions made by the leaders of these countries are being subject to what their constituencies want to hear. And their constituencies become more and more Islamic. So to say that NATO, for example, will forever protect Western Europe from foreign occupation, forget it. They are already occupied from within by the mass migration which they allowed. Look at Germany, what happens there. Look at Sweden, and you know what? There is some kind of whiplash when you see the right wing comes to this scenery, like Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, like Marine Le Pen in France, like the Strache people in Austria, like the Democratic Party in Sweden, that AfD means Alternative for Deutschland in Germany. When you see this right wing come to the center of the political arena, it is good, for them because they want to save their countries. But they don't solve the problem. The problem is migration. The problem is the birth jihad, means bringing children to the world. Look how many people in what you call it in Europe. How many children the Europeans have vis-a-vis how many children the Muslims have in Europe. And it's arithmetics. You can very easily calculate when in each and every country in Europe there will be a Muslim majority. It could be in 20 years and 30 years. Many of us will be still alive to see it. Fortunately or unfortunately, I don't know. But this is actually what we see. Therefore, their policies already today are being changed. And what we saw in the last, let's say, year, the surge of anti-Semitism is actually this, is being heated by the Islamic migration, which meets with the local Western European anti-Semitism and actually accelerates each other. And this is what we see on the street, in the streets, and finally also in decisions of presidents like Macron to give in Netanyahu if he dares to put his foot on French soil. And this is actually what is happening. The West, although we see today in the Cold War, or cold and maybe heated war, what happened in the Middle East, the West, I'm afraid to say here, has lost the battle. The West as a culture, the West as a civilization, the West as Europeanism, and I'm talking about Western Europeanism. The Eastern Europeanism, the Eastern European countries understood the problem, and they don't allow, I'm talking about Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovak Republic, they understood what this migration is and what it might cause, and this is why they don't accept migrants. It might not be nice, but at least they save their countries, especially in Hungary, what we hear from Urban.
This broadens out, your comments broaden out to the second dimension of our seminar, the implications for Europe and for Asia and the Pacific region of the changes we've been looking at. When I, very briefly, and I'd like Andrew to comment on this, when I look at this situation, I think metaphorically, it's not an exact mirror image, exact image, but the period of the 30s, particularly 37 to 39, and the rise of Hitler, and the weakness of the West, and the weakness of the League of Nations, paralleling the weakness of the United Nations, another element. It worries me. It looks as if a kind of crisis is building, so that the issue of Cold War, is it really a second Cold War, or is it the run-up to World War III or something equivalent to it? And of course, there's much debate about this, and I'd like our great historian and the author of the key work on World War II, Andrew, to comment.
Yes, this is a question that's often asked. In fact, there was a peer in the House of Lords who was asking it only yesterday. Where are we on that long Via Dolorosa of the 1930s? Are we at the point of the remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936? Are we at Anschluss? Are we at the Sudetenland? Or are we at Danzig and Poland? I think that it is actually quite a useful, no history is exactly the same, of course it isn't, but nonetheless, when Putin did unleash his completely unprovoked attack on Ukraine in Europe, this was a pretty horrific thing for a essentially totalitarian power to do to a democracy, not a perfect democracy, but a democracy where the votes of the people do actually decide who's president. So I'm not. I don't think we're quite at Munich yet, but we're certainly on that road. And what we need is what Winston Churchill famously described in the Munich speech, is a reversion to moral health and martial vigor, to stand up for freedom as in the olden time. That was his quotation, and that I think actually still bears fruit today. Whether we're going to do that or not, I'm not sure. We are not, in Britain at least, seem to be willing to do anything more than bump up our defense spending from 2.3% of GDP to 2.5% at some undisclosed time in the future. The Labour Party has said that Labour government says that it's a long-term aspiration. And that's only to put it up to 2.5% at a time when we don't have enough shells, 155mm shells in this country to last more than 5 days of a war if they're fired at the same kind of rate as the Ukrainians and Russians are firing them today. So it is a very nerve-wracking thing. We are cutting back our forces to 73,000 soldiers, the smallest amount since the beginning of the Napoleonic Wars. The Royal Navy is being cut back. At the moment, almost all of our frigates and destroyers have to act as supporters to our aircraft carriers. And this is at a time when globally the threats are growing. China has announced that it is going to increase its nuclear warheads by 3 times. The Chinese are building aircraft carriers. There's no need for an aircraft carrier if you are genuinely defensive in the way that that China states that it is. But it's also building ports around the country in Western Africa. Where does China need ports in Western Africa? And the answer is obviously to contest the Atlantic one day against the Americans. So we are, it seems to me, stuck in a trap of the Thucydidean trap, as it's called.
That raises the issue of where we're going. Historians are not necessarily well suited to gauge where we're going. The founder of our discipline, Leopold von Ranke, said that the goal of the historian was to understand the past, forgive the German, wie es eigentlich gewesen, right? The way it really was. If you don't understand the past, the way it really was, its language, its culture, the meaning of these terms, then you can't understand how it evolved, and hence you can't understand your own moment, your own present. And if you can't understand your own present properly, you have no chance of understanding the possible direction of the future. So we got to keep.
But one of the problems, sorry, just about in, Fred, is one of the problems is that our universities, our teachers in schools are not teaching the past as it really was. They are becoming more and more obsessed with ideology, with knocking the history of the country and the West and the whole concept of Western civilization. They're obsessed with the slave trade and imperialism and all of the negative aspects of, undeniably negative, many of them, aspects of Western civilization, and deliberately not teaching the positive ones. So, of course, we've got an identity problem, which is, in a sense, just as important and just as dangerous because it encourages appeasement and weakness, just as dangerous as the immigration one that Mordechai was pointing out earlier.
I think so, yes. The usual transmission belts of culture, one of the purposes of educational structures is to transmit the inheritance of the past, the notion of what the nation is and how it functions, what values are. That's totally broken down, as a matter of fact.
You see that in the attack on Winston Churchill that takes place the entire time. You know, they will not accept the left. That yes, Churchill made mistakes, of course he did. But overall, he was a very great man. He was the greatest Englishman who ever lived. And the way in which he is being knocked has got an underlying political philosophy behind it, because he was the greatest Englishman. It's part of British identity. It's essential for both the extreme left and indeed the extreme right in America, unfortunately, also to take knocks at him, which is fine if they are backed up by evidence, but over and over again they are not.
No, these people will project what they call their truth as an absolute, and their truth has no historical basis, and that makes the reform of education, which is so fundamental, a key part, for instance, of the Trump agenda. We have to reform education. How do you do that? Education begins in the family. It begins in the way in which children are brought up and the values which are imparted to them, and the schools which then take over and begin to play that role. Our schools today are not only not patriotic, quote unquote, but they are anti-patriotic. They're antinomian. They are, a culture has emerged which delights in destruction, in atomization, in anomie. And to put that back together again is a very, very complex business. But you have to start, I think, just to make a point, you have to start with the colleges of education, where the teachers who are going to be put into the public school system, K through 12, are educated. There is where the ideology is being instilled, and then it will be distributed by the products of these schools. But it's a large problem, a very large problem for all of us. We look at England and it makes one want to cry in terms of what's actually going on among the English. So
we do have luckily we have a Poilevre figure in England who can who's totally understands all of these issues and has got a plan to deal with it. Unfortunately, she's going to be leader of the opposition for the next 4 years, Kemi Badenoch, rather than prime minister. But at least there's somebody with the sort of whiff of Margaret Thatcher about her that can that will deal with these things. But obviously not for years, because we lost such a devastating landslide defeat in July.
Well, we're coming to towards the end of our discussion. We've touched on major issues. Mordechai, do you have anything that you'd like to say in a minute or two in passing?
Well, we are here in Israel in the crater of the volcano, of the Islamic volcano. And we are now looking to see the giant powers of the Sunni against the Shia, how they are struggling. Today, it's on the Syrian soil. Tomorrow, it might spread to other countries like Iraq, like inside Iran, Yemen as well. And this struggle will have large ramifications on many countries in the world, because if societies here in the Middle East become devastated, they just migrate to go to other countries. And other countries like Europe accept them. And this, what happens today, might create a new wave of migration from Syria now, Lebanon already for months already, and a new wave of migrants from the Middle East to Europe. And it does make a difference in Europe. And this is the situation which I cannot, predict what will happen, but definitely you can see that the broad lines of the developments, how they are here in the Middle East. Of course, we always have to expect some surprises on the way, but the trend is already clear. Iran is being now attacked by the peoples, in plural, of this region. Let's hope that they succeed.
Okay, we can now turn to Doris, who has a couple of questions, I think,
You just have,
directed at Andrew Roberts.
We have just a few minutes remaining. And Sir Roberts, Professor Kedar said that we are losing the war, the Cold War. Do you agree? And what can we do to reverse things? Big question.
Yes, I do agree, but I don't think it's, as I say, I think we're in the sort of Rhineland period rather than the Sudetenland. I think we've got vanishingly small amount of time to turn things round, but that we can turn things round for the simple reason that, well, first of all, we've got President Trump coming in promising larger defense spending in the United States, which will be very helpful. But also, the fact is that democracies tend to be better in struggles than totalitarian powers. They are more rational and logical in the way they fight them, in the strategies that they adopt, and also the way in which the people are behind the concept of democracy. Democracy is being undermined, of course it is, intellectually in the West, but it still is popular amongst ordinary people as the best form of government. So there are positive aspects, although the horrors that one sees of anti-Semitism in universities, for example, is monstrous. And I see a bit of that at Cambridge University.
Is there any change in that in the UK? Any changes?
Well, I mean, the fact is that also the universities are, in terms of what they're putting out, intellectually, still superior to the universities in the totalitarian countries. So we are getting the kind of innovation and technological advantage, which is absolutely key to staying in the forefront of the weapons production that we have to have. But in terms of the anti-Semitism in British universities, we just the other day at the Oxford Union had pro-Israel speakers screamed at and shouted down, and their freedom of speech denied by a small group of thugs, of Islamist thugs, who should have been, if they were undergraduates, sent down for that. And yet nothing seems to have been happening. Nothing seems to be happening to them at all. So it's a moment for a moral re-emergence, frankly, on the behalf of the West, to defend its values, which are superior to those of the Islamist, totalitarian, and terrorist enemies.
On behalf of CIJR, on behalf of everyone watching, thank you, Sir Andrew Roberts. Thank you, Professor Mordechai Kedar. Join us for our next exciting, enlightening webinar from Canadian Institute for Jewish Research. Bye for now.